This meeting is being recorded. And so it is. Welcome to web accessibility. By the end of this lesson, I hope you'll be able to enumerate 3 different things that you want to do to make the sites and apps that you make more accessible. So to start with, what we're going to do, I'm going to paste a link in chat, and we're going to spend a pretty darn long amount of time reading through this. So this is the Wcag accessibility guidelines. So when we talk about something being accessible, Wcag is usually the standard for that most people are going by. It is a spec of all the things that make something accessible or not accessible. One of the things that you'll see in this list is A, AA, and AAA accessibility. Those refer to different levels. So being single A accessible across the board is one level. If you're mostly AAs but have a single A, you're single A accessible with most of the work done to become AA accessible. You'll also notice that as you move up the accessibility levels, they start getting more and more restrictive about like what kinds of things you can conceivably do. So there's a good reason for like everybody to not be AAA accessible. But let's start with 10 minutes. We might use more. 10 minutes. Start at the place that I linked to, the perceivable area. You don't need to go through like all the meta shit about the spec. And I want you to write down as you're reading all the questions that come up. Questions about what we're doing? Cool. So start with 10 minutes, go through that link, write down your questions. Go. All right, so I'd like to give you, I'd like you to give me a fist to 5. Fist is I have no idea what we're supposed to be doing. 5 is I got through at least section 4, robust. Throw them up. How far did you get? Cool, Jen, where are you at? All right. For anybody who is a fist, what we are doing is if you'll check chat, we're reading through this. The first parts are the most important. I'm going to give us a couple more minutes. See if you can get through the robust section. And write down any questions that come up while you're reading. Thirty seconds. All right, that's time. Slack me the questions that you came up with. Oh man, Haley Ringer is totally trying to win the virtual high five. Keep slacking those questions on in. All right, Jen, send me what you got. All right, we got a pretty good list here. So let's take a look. All right, so here's all your questions. I'm going to group these a little bit. Okay. So how do devs in the real world keep track of all the best practices? Is it part of a code review? Is there a shorter go-to checklist? How do you use this as a tool for informing your day-to-day front-end development? Great question. So my answer to that is that you got a couple options. A lot of companies will produce their own checklists that are kind of specific to the sorts of apps that they make. So internal checklists are pretty common. Like most places I've worked have had some kind of accessibility checklist. You can also, and it's like larger organizations, you're often required to use an external accessibility auditing agency. Lots of them out there. One of my favorites is a tool called Axe. It's by this company called DQ or DK, and it's a browser extension. So it'll just tell you, it'll give you an accessibility score. And they also make a Cypress plugin called Cypress Axe that makes it one of your automated tests. And it's crazy fucking easy to use. You just do this command right there in your test, and it'll point out any accessibility failings you have. And what's cool about that is it will totally catch all kinds of like little stuff like accessibility tags in your HTML elements and stuff that are missing. It has to be run in the browser though, because it can't like analyze your code and see what is or isn't there, unless it's a static web page. If it's doing anything dynamic, which is all web apps, then it needs to be in process. It needs to be running to check the accessibility. See, other things you can do. Code reviews absolutely count. And I'll also say, just honestly, most teams suck ass at this. They don't take it seriously. And you can tell as soon as you start seeing a bunch of div soup, you're like, okay, well, this organization doesn't really care that much about accessibility. But if you do, then some mix of these is probably part of your workflow. And what's especially interesting about the companies who don't take the accessibility stuff seriously is that it's not just a good idea, it's the law. You can get popped for an ADA discrimination lawsuit if your web app isn't accessible. Just happened to Domino's. It's a super expensive problem, so don't run into it. But yeah, these are probably the main tools that are to reach for. There's a couple like kind of cheapy, like run my web page through, let's see, accessibility audit. There's a couple of these sites you can just give it a URL and it will try to give you back their guess at a score. And you can, there's also, Wcag isn't the only one. There's a bunch of other ones too. Like the government one is section 508. So you could say, all right, I need to be section 508 and Wcag. And sometimes you can just plug a URL into something and it'll try to give you a score. Cool. One other thing that nobody asked that I think you should have is about color contrast. This is like, among teams that are taking accessibility seriously, this is the one that murders people the most, is trying to hit the color contrast ratios. So accessible color contrast. WebAIM is also just a really killer tool overall. But you put in a foreground color and a background color and it gives you a contrast ratio. So if our foreground color is white and our background color, or sorry, if our foreground color is black and our background color is, shit, I meant that the other way around, didn't I? Yeah, I did. Cool. So it'll give you an idea of, at different sizes, whether or not you pass contrast for it. So that's an easy one. 21:1 will always pass. But it starts getting a little bit trickier when you go, all right, I'm going to do red. All right, well, now we're down to 4.3. That's not like a crazy red or anything. That red on white is only a 4.3 to 1, and it fails all accessibility on normal text and only works on fairly large text. I can't tell you how many shitty fucking government and school and like whatever websites that use a red like this at regular font weight. Not accessible. Sometimes, I don't know if this will be the case on this checker. Yeah, this one just flips it. The more robust tools will do perceptual contrast, and foreground and background make a big difference on that. Your ability to perceive something on a lighter background way easier than perceiving a lighter thing on a darker background. So like as you're coming up with a color palette for your site, like you should be spending a lot of time with your contrast checking tools, making sure that you're hitting the level that you think you are. And you'd be shocked at how much that constrains you. Cool. How can assistive technology ignore elements? with Aria tags. So Aria is accessible rich internet applications. These are just attributes that we can throw on HTML elements. And if we want assistive technologies to ignore the element, that's what we do. If we want to hide an element visually, we use display none in CSS, right? Well, assistive technologies effectively ignore your CSS. So even though it's not visibly on the page, your assistive technologies still see it. You can actually use this to really good advantage. For example, a section in HTML, like this. Stop it. So a section tag is, like, by definition, supposed to have a heading. That's what makes it different than just a regular old div. But you can imagine a scenario in which you don't want that to actually just show up in your design. Either because it's already indicated by something else, or some like good logical reason why the heading shouldn't be there. You still should have it for semantics, and like that's especially handy for something like a screen reader. And then you just do easy. Still accessible. You can still make it look however you want to. And so if you have something that's purely decorative, its only function is visual, so the opposite of this, then Aria Rule none will take it out of the accessibility tree, so assistive technologies will effectively ignore it. Which will also kind of answer this. Repeated elements, you can use Aria Rule none on the extra ones to just make it skip it. Cool. Can you flag to bring attention?
Hey, Kyle.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Like, let's say you have a pretty like deep object tree.
Mm-hmm.
If you put it at the top, like HTML element, does it ignore everything underneath it?
Correct. Can you flag to bring attention to certain elements, such as elevating the priority? Not that I know of. Now, like, priority is going to be highly contextual, though. Like, what one user wants to do on your site, what's high priority for them, might not be high priority to somebody else. So regular HTML semantics go a long way in this regard. So, for example, if it's a form and you used a form element, like someone with assistive technologies who's trying to fill out a form will be able to get to that relatively easily. Same thing with, if they're trying to do an action, they can look for buttons and that kind of thing. Now, if for whatever reason you can't use the semantic element, that's another thing that Aria gives you. Aria can give you role button or role form, and that'll show up to the assistive technology the same way. So that I would handle something like that with Aria. Sign language in addition to caption addition in order to be AA or AAA. Why? Don't they accomplish the same thing? I mean, the real answer is I don't know, but my guessy answer has to do with trying to create a truly like parody experience. And
Kyle, can I jump in on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
That, from my understanding, there are some members of the deaf community where reading English is a second language. So it would be harder for them to read captions than it would be to read sign language.
Cool. I'll take that. And one of the cool things about Wcag is, like, you don't necessarily need to be like super embedded in the disabled community to like get some of these things. You can just take their word for it, and then like you end up finding out things like that. But Wcag in particular has been pretty well researched and vetted for a very long time. Cool. So, does meeting this criteria require designing wholly different apps or spaces, or can there be triggers for assistive technology embedded in the main app? So, in general, like, you don't want to have the accessible version of your site. That's going to rub an awful lot of people the wrong way and be like twice as expensive to do effectively. It's like it's a separate but equal kind of thing. We're like, no, just make your main experience accessible. And here's like kind of the wild thing about this. Like accessible is kind of like falling out of favor as like a term generally in favor of the term universal access. And part of the impetus behind that is that a lot of the things that make something accessible aren't just for like blind users or something like that. They also make it more usable for literally everybody. Using correct semantic tags for things, yeah, that's really cool. Like if you're using a screen reader, it also makes like tabbing between forms work better. And you don't have to have like carpal tunnel or something that prevents you from using a mouse. Like I try to use keyboard navigation for my browser, like whenever I can. It's just fucking faster. And so many of the things that increase access for your app are also just really good design ideas. Same thing with the contrast. Even if you can tell the contrast between two different colors, that doesn't mean it's easy on your eyes. So you like it's a lot of the stuff ends up being very good design assistance anyway. What does it mean when it's talking about changes of context in 3, 2, 1? Let's take a look. Here we go. So a context change is user agent, viewport, focus, or a change in content. So user agent, you'll see this term come up over and over again on the web. User agent 99% of the time means browser. So like, I mean, we can even look at the headers that we send out and come back. If I go to the network and refresh this page, and I take a look at the headers that I sent over, one of them is, ooh, do I have it disabled? Oh, nope. Came back over here. Request headers. User agent, Mozilla 5.0 on Ubuntu Linux. Firefox version 79. What do you know? That's exactly the thing that I'm using. And so, and you can also spoof that. So, for example, let's see if I have a spoofer in. I might not. Don't have one installed right now. But there's like, it's really common to have browser plugins that will allow you to spoof different ones. Or if you've ever on your phone done like show me the desktop site, the thing that's changing is the user agent. You go, instead of like, I'm on a phone using Firefox. And they go, all right, well, you can't do that on a phone. You go, fuck you. I'm on a desktop using Firefox then. And then all of a sudden it shows you the actual thing you want to use. So what they're saying is that if you change your user agent, it shouldn't re-render the page effectively. So viewport is that. If I do that, that's a change in context per Wcag. You're changing the viewport. And then focus, it has specifically with inputs. So buttons, input fields, text areas, as you click on those, they gain focus. And as you leave them, they blur or lose focus. And so what that particular Wcag thing is, when you focus in on something, it doesn't trigger a change of context for the app. So it doesn't go, oh, you focused in on this. That must mean you want the viewport to be more like this. It's disorienting, and so it violates the predictability guideline.
So that would also be like, there are some websites where if you click on an input, it like zooms in on that area.
Exactly. And like, you can imagine that something like that might make you sick if you have like a motion sickness disorder, but also, who the fuck wants this? It's part of the universal access thing. Makes it better for everybody. Okay. Written. Say no separate but equal. That's also the case with like mobile sites, FYI. Once upon a time, they were called M sites. And so you go to like m.youtube.com. That's extremely frowned upon anymore. So this was viewport or content change on focus. What is binary display orientation? Binary display orientation is switching between landscape and portrait, or viewing those as like two. If you've ever used an app where you go horizontal and all of a sudden it's a completely different app, because it like, oh well, when you hold it sideways, you must be intending to do this, and when you do it this way, you must be intending to do that. That's not accessible. People might be in different orientations for reasons that have nothing to do with their desire to use content one way or another. Pointer cancellation, I don't know. I can look that up in a sec though. Naming everything. So this has to do with inputs on forms. Like if I make a form like this, and this one is cool, and maybe even give them IDs. Oops, that should be like that. And then I do a input type submit. Okay, so there's a form. Those of you in mod 3 know exactly how we could deal with this. We capture the form submission action, and then we take out the name with like a query selector by ID name, query selector by ID age. We send off a fetch request. Nailed it. Man, if we're doing that, really doesn't even need to be this. I could do div class form and just make that a div. That'll totally work. Won't be accessible though. Indicating that it was a form in the first place with the correct semantic tag, that's like raising the priority. And assistive technology might be able to go, by the way, did you want to just fill out the form that's on this page? Like, yeah, that's exactly what I want to do. It can take them there. You could do Aria role form, or you could just call it a fucking form. Likewise, what they are saying about naming everything is, even though you may not technically need to put a name on those inputs, you should. There's no good reason not to. And you still need the IDs because that's what the labels will match to. But even if you're not using form data or whatever JavaScript way to pull an input type by name, we still want that to be labeled correctly. Like that.
So do the text readers look for that name attribute in each of the tags so they can read it to the person?
Yeah. They can go, what would you like to fill out the age thing as? Except if you've ever heard a screen reader before, it's like, it goes really fast.
And then with that, you still would want to put a label, right?
Oh,
Generally.
correct. And very similar to, say, name for, would work like that. And this is another great thing where maybe you don't want that to visually show up. For example, it's really hot to do labeling with placeholder text like that. Cool. Still need to have it labeled. Now you don't need to show the label. We can do display none on that. It's totally reasonable. Should still be there. And like I find that that's really helpful for developers also. Like it's a lot easier to figure out what's happening with this. If I'm just reading your code and trying to understand it, I got a way better shot at that with this very verbosely labeled form than I do with, oh, let me look at the JavaScript real quick to see how you're using this. What does A11Y mean? It's this obnoxious thing that people in tech started doing. Accessibility is very difficult to spell. And so there are 11 characters in between the A and the Y in accessibility. So it's A11Y. You'll also see that with I8N, which is internationalization. You'll also see that with K8S, which is Kubernetes. Basically, any long-ass word, somebody's going to do that to it. How do video games meet these guidelines? They generally don't. It's just the truth of it. Like I said, you don't have to, like, if there's something that makes something fundamentally accessible and like you still need to do it to accomplish the shit in your app, you can get ADA waivers for that. And something like a video game would probably meet that. Also, give it a shot. You might be able to get closer than you think. Is there a AAA accessible video game? That's a super good question. Are there AAA accessible video games? Game accessibility. It looks like chat has some requirements. Waived because they're entertainment, not communication. Ooh, there's newer accessibility requirements in games. Interesting. Check this. This is pretty much always the case. If you try to bolt on accessibility after you're done, you're going to have a bad time. If this is just something that's part of your definition of done for all your thin vertical slices, it goes a lot easier. It would not surprise me at all that Minecraft is super accessible. Yeah, I noticed this. I just finished Celeste recently, and yeah, there's like an assist mode on this where like you're invincible or you can slow the game down. So this hits those like time requirements, and you might go, well, but man, that's cheating. I don't know if like you have a disability that prevents you from doing that. Maybe that's just kind of evening out the playing field, and like you are not required to play with it. So there you go. Cool. Alternatives for time-based media include, so time-based stuff is like, hit this button in the next 5 seconds to move on. Stuff like that. They actually are like super specific about alternatives that you have to offer to that to meet accessibility guidelines. So that could be things like, I need an extension. I'm not ready to make a decision yet, just give me more time. Or being able to universally disable any of those kinds of things. And they might be a great user experience for somebody else. They almost never are. But the ability to like modify those if like you have a movement impairment, for example. Captions or transcripts for audio impaired, dictation for visually. Yep, that's how you do that. And there's, so we did, Develop Denver, the organization I run. Last year we tried to do like our really damnedest on accessibility stuff for the conference. And so we had an interpreter that we had, I think, 2 people at the event that were hearing impaired. So we hired an interpreter, and we hired 2 actually, because like it's exhausting to sign all day. So they have to take turns. And one of the things that we found out really early on is like for a live presentation, like that's a difficult thing. And like that would have just exploded our budget to try to do live captioning. Google Slides, of all things, does it in real time. If you just turn on Google Slides and like turn on like an assistance mode, it did a pretty fucking good job, like with our keynote and stuff. Also, I'll say, having like given a few presentations at that conference, it is really fun to say like a really idiomatic swear word and then like look to see how it gets signed. Like abso-fucking-lutely. It's like, what is that? Cool. So give me some new questions.
This is not a question, but a revelation. Project that I'm working on. Apparently the text color I chose has a 1.32 accessibility on a white background.
Yeah.
Which is horrible. So I'm gonna have to
Yes.
address that.
Good. What else?
The check to see if you're a robot, right?
Oh,
How does
yeah.
that work with disability? Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty gnarly. And so reCAPTCHA will like, it'll give you alternatives to that. And Elise and I were doing one yesterday where we had to turn it on. It's like, well, it's case sensitive, and part of the CAPTCHA is you're playing with the sizes and stuff, and there was an O that was all distorted. That could be a lowercase o, an uppercase O, or a 0, very plausibly.
I fail those things all the time.
Constantly. What else?
When is it better to use, like, I don't really know how to word this, like a button versus a link, like an anchor tag? Like, what's the difference, and why? When do you use that? Like, when do you use that?
That's an outstanding question. And this actually isn't even an accessibility thing. This is a semantic HTML thing. So the difference is if you are navigating to a different part of the site, even if it's on the same page, that's an anchor tag. If you're performing an action on the page, that's a button. So you can think of it as a state change. If you're attempting to change the state or produce a side effect, so like printing, that would be a button. If you're trying to expand or collapse something, that's a button. If you are trying to confirm that like you accept and understand something, that's a button. If you're trying to go to this section of the long screed that you're reading, that's a link. If you're navigating to a different part of the site, that's a link. Great question. Any others?
If you are trying to get a specific like style, so of like moving elements around and you end up having to like bury them inside of other objects to get them to appropriately react in a expecting way, how would you handle that?
Sure. So you can use Aria Rules to help with some of this. And like sometimes that's just a matter of like hiding things. And I'll also say that these tend to be kind of rare. As your CSS chops get stronger, then your need to like wrap shit in like one wrapper after another like radically decreases. So I'd say in practice, I have never had to use more than 2 semantic wrappers on something. And even that's pretty unusual. And it ends up being for things like this. If I go to my site, that little explosion, that I had to use wrappers to pull that off because all of these are absolutely positioned relative to some container. Now, like these are regular old anchor tags. Like if we look at just a regular old anchor, but yeah, I had to use 2 wrappers to pull this off. This outer one to flex it to the center, and this one to provide an absolute positioning context to put all these things relative to. But I really didn't do that much to fuck with the accessibility of it because ultimately it's a div with an image and this little speech bubble that I could probably use Aria display none because it's mostly decorative. And then 3 anchor tags. Still totally accessible.
Completely unrelated to accessibility. Are the little points coming down from the speech bubbles, are those just like before or after CSS effects?
Yes, they are. There are these things right here. And you can see, if you look at the thing that's being highlighted, looks like a parallelogram. That's the actual, like, it's called a pseudo element. It's pure CSS. That's the shape of it. And I used borders, these like kind of complicated borders. Some of them are transparent and some of them are white, and they end up making that shape. And then I think they have some effect on it too that's kind of clever. Or no, it's on the entire thing. It's this filter. So then you can drop shadow the entire thing, even though that's sort of a weird shape. Isn't that cool? If I used like a regular box shadow or something, that wouldn't work. You'd see that it would give away the trick like immediately. But this filter lets you have the same effect. And like that's a perfect example of like, you could also do this in some pretty tortured ways. But if you're thoughtful enough about the CSS and the semantics of it and stuff, these are the only 2 non-semantic things in that entire section. Cool, so here's what I want you to do now. I would like you, the goal of this was that you would have 3 things that you can do to make your site more accessible for your next site or app. We talk about all kinds of different things that applies to. So now I would like you to Slack me 3 things that you're going to do to make your site more accessible. Go.
Are these guidelines or specific ideas?
Porque no los dos? So you can talk about color contrast. You can talk about a specific thing that you're working on right now. 3 things. Tools you plan on using. Outstanding, Bryce. Ah, these are great. Keep them coming. Good job, Jen. All right, I think that's the bunch. Great job, everybody. Thank you so much, and I'll see you at stand down. Cheers.
Thanks for doing this, Kyle.
Absolutely. It's fun.